Ladies and gentlemen, the rise of US populism, of Trumpism, is an interesting phenomenon, and I have taken a closer look at this from a research perspective. So I have used there some of the survey results of Lind and McCall who show that there is a majority of Americans who think that there is an inequality problem in the US, so the increased inequality is considered to be unfair. On the other hand, they have shown that a relative majority, holds the view that this inequality should be corrected by the big companies, by the US multinationals. But I think this, unfortunately, is really wishful thinking. And this points to a very serious problem in the US because the implication is that there is something like structural US populism. Why this? Well, there is this increasing inequality. So, for instance, the share of the lower half of the US households in terms of income, their share in national income has dropped from about 20% in 1981 to 13% in 2015. For comparison, in Western Europe, the decline was from 22% to 20%. So it's not such a dramatic situation in the EU. And if then a majority of US voters experiences continued frustration in the sense that they expect, the big multinationals, the big companies, they should correct this big inequality in the US, I think this is not going to work. Just on the contrary, the economic drivers of inequality in the US and in other OECD countries are continuing. These drivers are financial globalization, which bring more integrated financial markets and lower real interest rates. So that's very nice if you have collateral and if you are a skilled worker, if you have a nice income, then you can go to a bank, you can get a loan at a lower real interest rate, and you can buy real estate, you can buy stocks, and you will benefit from this. For the unskilled workers, on the other hand, this is not really an option, and that means that we could say the polarization of worker incomes, so skilled versus unskilled in the US, is going to increase. There are two other drivers. One is digitization of the economy, which causes a skilled biased technological progress, meaning increasing relative demand for skilled workers. And there is the China factor, so China's increasing exports. And very often when we see, after a few years of Chinese exports in a certain sector, that these export volumes reach fairly high numbers, well then we see, of course, falling prices of the respective product. Now, if you are a company operating in the respective sector, you have two alternatives. You basically can say, okay, I also have to lower now my prices, but then you have to reduce your costs. You would have to reduce wages of workers, and this again means then that China's export would, in this sense, contribute to wage polarization. And there is an OECD paper with some evidence on that. On the other hand, the alternative is you would say, let's focus on product innovations, on product upgrading. This is a typical reaction, I would say, in Germany and Sweden, Austria, and many other European countries. And on the other hand, it's clear you can do this only if you as a company, if you have a sufficient number of skilled workers, if you have adequate research and development facilities, good organization, staff, and so on. Now, the problem is that if you look at the share of workers who have problems with reading, who have no mathematical skills, or actually have problems in both fields, there the negatively leading countries in the OECD are Italy, Spain, France, the US. And then much, much better, for instance, Germany. Now the United States spends how much with public money on retraining? 0.01%. Germany, for comparison, 0.25%. Switzerland, which always almost has had full employment, they nevertheless spend government money on retraining, which is about 0.2% of GDP. Denmark, 0.5% of GDP. So the US and actually also the UK has a big problem here. I think they are underspending on retraining. And it's also very interesting actually to look at some of the inequality statistics and the aspects highlighted by Janet Yellen in a paper of 2014 focusing on the US. So one of the problems which the US also has is that the US spends 17% of GDP on healthcare expenditures. Germany and France each about 11%. And where do we have the higher life expectancy? This is in Germany and France, almost 3 years higher than in the US. Where do you have the lower infant mortality? This is again in Western Europe. And if the United States would have had the same low infant mortality as Germany and France over the past 60 years, the number of Americans, the US population, would be 50 million, roughly 50 million higher today than it actually is. Now we all understand that the United States cannot be expected to simply import European-style social markets economy or a German healthcare system. But it's absolutely clear that the US has a lot of inefficiencies in its health care system. So for instance, there's a bewildering price variance of hospital prices. And often the poor who have no insurance, when they have to go to the hospital, they would pay the highest price. So that's very strange. And it is clear that the European social market economies, to some extent, have a better situation in terms of social cohesion, life expectancy, and so on. This does not rule out that, for instance, in the case of Germany, there's a lot of public debate on rising inequality, and when you compare what people have as a view on the German inequality and how the inequality really is, what you see is an overestimation of poverty problems in Germany, and actually an overestimation also of the number of rich people. So I think researchers can contribute to a better debate, to more rationality in policy choices by highlighting the facts, also by emphasizing what obviously is not true. For instance, when US presidential candidate Donald Trump in his Phoenix speech was saying, why should we be against immigration and social policies in the US, he was saying that roughly 60% of the money is all taken by the immigrants, which really is nonsense. So here we have, I think, certain challenges, and it is not good for the US and not good for the Western world, not good for the world economy, if we have such ongoing populism in the United States. So what we need is a better transatlantic policy dialogue. I think everybody can learn from everybody else. We can learn from US venture capitalism, innovation, digital economy, and so on. And the Americans certainly would be wise to consider more carefully the European social market economies or the healthcare policy in Singapore, which is partially market-driven, partially has a government pillar and has broad coverage. Singapore has very high life expectancy. So one can learn from each other if one doesn't put up all these ideological barriers, and if one really puts the focus on facts. Wishful thinking never is helpful. This, of course, does not mean that the EU countries are not facing their own challenges in terms of reforms in the field of social policies, innovation, growth policy, and so on. And for instance, the fast aging process in Germany, in Italy, in Portugal, Spain, Greece, and so on is a big challenge for these countries. So in the end, I think we all have an interest to take a closer look at these facts, at the theoretical and comparative research, and under the heading The Global Trump, and also in an EIIW research paper, which I have written this year, you find a lot of insights, a lot of interesting analytical points, a lot of policy reform proposals, which is worthwhile to read, I would say.